I don't know how many chapters we'll get through today. Well, about 2 hours worth, for whatever that counts for. Let's do it. Chapter 8, The Pincian of Today. Phoebe, on entering the shop, beheld there the already familiar face of the little devourer, if we can reckon his mighty deeds aright, of Jim Crow, the elephant, the camel, the dromedaries, and the locomotive. Having expended his private fortune on the 2 preceding days in the purchase of the above unheard-of luxuries, the young gentleman's present errand was on the part of his mother, in quest of 3 eggs and half a pound of raisins. These articles Phoebe accordingly supplied, and as a mark of gratitude for his previous patronage, and a slight superadded morsel after breakfast, put likewise into his hand a whale. The great fish, reversing his experience with the prophet of Nineveh, immediately began his progress down the same red pathway of fate whither so varied a caravan had preceded him. This remarkable urchin, in truth, was the very emblem of old Father Time, both in respect of his all-devouring appetite for men and things, and because he, as well as Time, after engulfing thus much of creation, looked almost as youthful as if he had been just that moment made. After partly closing the door, the child turned back and mumbled something to Phoebe, which, as the whale was but half disposed of, she could not perfectly understand. "What did you say, my little fellow?" asked Phoebe. "Mother wants to know," repeated Ned Higgins more distinctly, "how old Maid Pincian's brother does. Folks say he's got a home." "My cousin Hepzibah's brother," exclaimed Phoebe, surprised at this sudden explanation of the relationship between Hepzibah and her guest. "Her brother? And where can he have been?" The little boy only put his thumb to his broad snub nose, with that look of shrewdness which a child, spending much of his time in the street, so soon learns to throw over his features, however unintelligent in themselves. And then, as Phoebe continued to gaze at him, without answering his mother's message, he took his departure. As the child went down the steps, a gentleman ascended them and made his entrance into the shop. It was the portly, and, had it possessed the advantage of a little more height, would have been the stately figure of a man considerably in the decline of life, dressed in a black suit of some thin stuff, resembling broadcloth as closely as possible. A gold-headed cane of rare oriental wood added materially to the high respectability of his aspect, as did also a neckcloth of the utmost snowy purity, and the conscientious polish of his boots. His dark, square countenance, with its almost shaggy depth of eyebrows, was naturally impressive, and would, perhaps, have been rather stern, had not the gentleman considerately taken upon himself to mitigate the harsh effect by a look of exceeding good humour and benevolence. Owing, however, to a somewhat massive accumulation of animal substance about the lower region of his face, the look was, perhaps, unctuous rather than spiritual. He's going to look up unctuous real fast. Unctuous. Excessively flattering or ingratiating. Oily. He seemed anxious to please, but not in an unctuous way. Okay. The look was, perhaps, unctuous rather than spiritual, and had, so to speak, a kind of fleshly effulgence, not altogether so satisfactory as he doubtless intended it to be. A susceptible observer, at any rate, might have regarded it as affording very little evidence of the general benignity of soul, whereof it purported to be the outward reflection. and if the observer chanced to be ill-natured, as well as acute and susceptible, he would probably suspect that the smile on the gentleman's face was a good deal akin to the shine on his boots, and that each must have cost him and his boot-black, respectively, a good deal of hard labor to bring out and preserve them. As the stranger entered the little shop, where the projection of the second story and the thick foliage of the elm tree, as well as the commodities at the window, created a sort of grey medium, his smile grew as intense as if he had set his heart on counteracting the whole gloom of the atmosphere, besides any moral gloom pertaining to Hepzibah and her inmates, by the unassisted light of his countenance. On perceiving a young rosebud of a girl instead of the gaunt presence of the old maid, a look of surprise was manifest. He at first knit his brows, then smiled with more unctuous benignity than ever. "Ah, I see how it is," said he in a deep voice, a voice which, had it come from the throat of an uncultivated man, would have been gruff, but now, by dint of careful training, was now sufficiently agreeable. "I was not aware that Miss Hepzibah Pyncheon had commenced business under such favourable auspices. You are her assistant, I suppose?" "I certainly am," answered Phoebe, and added with a little air of ladylike assumption, for, civil as the gentleman was, he evidently took her to be a young person serving for wages, "I am a cousin of Miss Hepzibah, on a visit to her." "Her cousin, and from the country? Pray pardon me, then," said the gentleman, bowing and smiling, as Phoebe never had been bowed to nor smiled on before. "In that case we must be better acquainted, for unless I am sadly mistaken, you are my own little kinswoman likewise. Let me see, Mary, Dolly, Phoebe. Yes, Phoebe is the name. Is it possible that you are Phoebe Pyncheon, only child of my dear cousin and classmate Arthur? Ah, I see your father now, about your mouth. Yes, we must be better acquainted. I am your kinsman, my dear. Surely you must have heard of Judge Pyncheon." As Phoebe curtsied in reply, the judge bent forward with the pardonable and even praiseworthy purpose, considering the nearness of blood and the difference of age, of bestowing on his young relative a kiss of acknowledged kindred and natural affection. Unfortunately, without design, or only with such instinctive design as gives no account of itself to the intellect, Phoebe, just at the critical moment, drew back, so that her highly respectable kinsman, with his body bent over the counter and his lips protruded, was betrayed into the rather absurd predicament of kissing the empty air. It was a modern parallel to the case of Ixion embracing a cloud, and was so much the more ridiculous as the judge prided himself on eschewing all airy matter, and never mistaking a shadow for a substance. The truth was, and it is Phoebe's only excuse, that although Judge Pyncheon's glowing benignity might not be absolutely unpleasant to the feminine beholder, with the width of a street or even an ordinary-sized room interposed between, yet it became quite too intense when this dark, full-fed physiognomy, so roughly bearded, too, that no razor could ever make it smooth, sought to bring itself into actual contact with the object of its regards. The man, the sex, somehow or other, was entirely too prominent in the judge's demonstrations of that sort. Phoebe's eyes sank, and without knowing why, she felt herself blushing deeply under his look. Yet she had been kissed before, and without any particular squeamishness, by perhaps half a dozen different cousins, younger as well as older than this dark-browned, grizzly-bearded, white-neck-clothed, and unctuously benevolent judge. Then why not by him? On raising her eyes, Phoebe was startled by the change in Judge Pinchin's face. It was quite as striking, allowing for the difference of scale, as that betwixt a landscape under a broad sunshine and just before a thunderstorm. Not that it had the passionate intensity of the latter aspect, but was cold, hard, immitigable, like a day-long brooding cloud. "Dear me, what is to be done now?" thought the country girl to herself. "He looks as if there were nothing softer in him than a rock, nor milder than the east wind. I meant no harm. Since he really is my cousin, I would have let him kiss me, if I could." Then all at once it struck Phoebe that this very Judge Pinchin was the original of the miniature which the daguerreotypist had shown her in the garden, and that the hard, stern, relentless look now on his face was the same that the sun had so inflexibly persisted in bringing out. Was it, therefore, no momentary mood, but, however skilfully concealed, the settled temper of his life? And not merely so, but was it hereditary in him, and transmitted down as a precious heirloom from that bearded ancestor, in whose picture both the expression, and, to a singular degree, the features of the modern judge were shown as by a kind of prophecy? A deeper philosopher than Phoebe might have found something very terrible in this idea. It implied that the weaknesses and defects, the bad passions, the mean tendencies, and the moral diseases which lead to crime are handed down from one generation to another by a far surer process of transmission than human law has been able to establish in respect to the riches and honors which it seeks to entail upon posterity. Man, Nathaniel Hawthorne! Good gracious! Some of these sentences. But, as it happened, scarcely had Phoebe's eyes rested again on the judge's countenance than all its ugly sternness vanished, and she found herself quite overpowered by the sultry dog-day heat, as it were, of benevolence, which this excellent man diffused out of his great heart into the surrounding atmosphere, very much like a serpent, which, as a preliminary to fascination, is said to fill the air with its peculiar odor. "I like that, Captain Phoebe," cried he, with an emphatic nod of approbation. "I like it much, my little cousin. You are a good child, and know how to take care of yourself. A young girl, especially if she be a very pretty one, can never be too chary of her lips." "Indeed, sir," said Phoebe, trying to laugh the matter off, "I did not mean to be unkind." Nevertheless, whether or no it were entirely owing to the inauspicious commencement of their acquaintance, she still acted under a certain reserve, which was by no means customary to her frank and genial nature. The fantasy would not quit her, that the original Puritan, of whom she had heard so many sombre traditions, the progenitor of the whole race of New England Pinchians, the founder of the house of the Seven Gables, and who had died so strangely in it, had now stepped into the shop. In these days of off-hand equipment the matter was easily enough arranged. On his arrival from the other world, he had merely found it necessary to spend a quarter of an hour at a barber's, who had trimmed down the Puritan's full beard into a pair of grizzled whiskers. Then, patronizing a ready-made clothing establishment, he had exchanged his velvet doublet and sable cloak, with the richly worked band under his chin, for a white collar and cravat, coat, vest, and pantaloons, and lastly put aside his steel-hilted broadsword to take up a gold-headed cane. The Colonel Pinchin of 2 centuries ago steps forward as the judge of the passing moment. Of course, Phoebe was far too sensible a girl to entertain this idea in any other way than as matter for a smile. Possibly, also, could the two personages have stood together before her eye, many points of difference would have only Blah, blah, blah. Possibly, also, could the two personages have stood together before her eye. Oh man, okay. Having trouble with this one. Possibly, also, could the two personages have stood together before her eye, many points of difference would have been perceptible, and perhaps only a general resemblance. The long lapse of intervening years, in a climate so unlike that which had fostered the ancestral Englishman, must inevitably have wrought important changes in the physical system of his descendant. The judge's volume of muscle could hardly be the same as the colonel's. There was undoubtedly less beef in him. Though looked upon as a weighty man among his contemporaries in respect of animal substance, and as favored with a remarkable degree of fundamental development, while adapting him for the judicial bench, we conceive that the modern Judge Pinchian, if weighed in the same balance with his ancestor, would have required at least an old-fashioned 56 to keep the scale in equilibrio. Then the judge's face had lost the ruddy English hue that showed its warmth through all the duskiness of the colonel's weather-beaten cheek, and had taken a sallow shade, the established complexion of his countryman. If we mistake not, moreover, a certain quality of nervousness had become more or less manifest, even in so solid a specimen of Puritan descent as the gentleman now under discussion. As one of its effects, it bestowed on his countenance a quicker mobility than the old Englishman's had possessed, and keener vivacity, but at the expense of a sturdier something, on which these acuter endowments seemed to act like dissolving acids. This process, for aught we know, may belong to the great system of human progress, which, with every ascending footstep, as it diminishes the necessity for animal force, may be destined gradually to spiritualize us by refining away our grosser attributes of body. If so, Judge Pinchian could endure a century or two more of such refinement, as well as most other men. The similarity, intellectual and moral, between the judge and his ancestor appears to have been at least as strong as the resemblance of mien and feature would afford reason to anticipate. In old Colonel Pinchian's funeral discourse, the clergyman absolutely canonized his deceased parishioner, and opening, as it were, a vista through the roof of the church, and thence through the firmament above, showed him seated, harp in hand, among the crowned choristers of the spiritual world. On his tombstone, too, the record is highly eulogistic. Nor does history, so far as he holds a place upon its page, assail the consistency and uprightness of his character. So, also, as regards the Judge Pinchian of today, neither clergyman nor legal critic, nor inscriber of tombstones, nor historian of general or local politics would venture a word against this eminent person's sincerity as a Christian, or respectability as a man, or integrity as a judge, or courage and faithfulness as the often-tried representative of his political party. But besides these cold, formal, and empty words of the chisel that inscribes, the voice that speaks, and the pen that writes, for the public eye and for distant time, and which inevitably lose much of their truth and freedom by the fatal consciousness of so doing, there were traditions about the ancestor, and private diurnal gossip about the judge, remarkably accordant in their testimony. It is often instructive to take the woman's, the private and domestic, view of a public man. Nor can anything be more curious than the vast discrepancy between portraits intended for engraving and the pencil sketches that pass from hand to hand behind the original's back. Man, they're doing a lot of comparing here. A lot of comparing. William says, early, okay, a little catching up with chat here real fast. William says, early voting started today, okay, in your state, okay. Melissa just called and they want to wait 2 hours to turn in your ballot and vote themselves. They had to wait for 2 hours. Yeah, that's been happening, apparently, on the first day of early voting. Every man and their dog's been showing up. And woman. Yeah, so, but it's early voting, so, after a couple of days, I think the novelty will, and excitement would have worn off a bit. I think the lines will be a little more under control. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, yeah, gotta get that ballot in. Sure, why not? Alrighty. Okay, Shadow Pops is going to wait a few days. Yeah, that's, yeah. Boy, oh boy. Okay. Mate, so there's a lot of comparisons going on between this judge and the old colonel. The old colonel. Man. Let's do it. For example, a tradition affirmed that the Puritan had been greedy of wealth. The judge, too, with all the show of liberal expenditure, was said to be as close-fisted as if his grip were of iron. The ancestor had clothed himself in a grim assumption of kindliness, and a rough heartiness of word and manner, which most people took to be the genuine warmth of nature, making its way through the thick and inflexible hide of a manly character. His descendant, in compliance with the requirements of a nicer age, had etherealized this rude benevolence into that broad benignity of smile wherewith he shone like a noonday sun along the streets, or glowed like a household fire in the drawing-rooms of his private acquaintance. The Puritan, if not belied by some singular stories, murmured even at this day, under the narrator's breath, the Puritan, if not belied by some singular stories, murmured even at this day under the narrator's breath, had fallen into certain transgressions, to which men of his great animal development, whatever their faith or principles, must continue liable, until they put off impurity, along with the gross earthly substance that involves it. We must not stain our page with any contemporary scandal to a similar purport that may have been whispered against the judge. The Puritan, again, an autocrat in his own household, had worn out 3 wives, and merely by the remorseless weight and hardness of his character in the conjugal relation had sent them, one after another, broken-hearted, to their graves. Here the parallel, in some sort, fails. The judge had wedded but a single wife, and lost her in the 3rd or 4th year of their marriage. There was a fable, however, for such we choose to consider it, though not impossibly typical of Judge Pincian's marital deportment, that the lady got her death-blow in the honeymoon, and never smiled again, because her husband compelled her to serve him with coffee every morning at his bedside in token of fealty to her liege lord and master. Good morning. Anya's like, I'm here, you can start now. Yeah, time don't wait for nothing around here, Anya, sorry. Good to see you as well, Melissa. Melissa's back as well. Yeah, very good. All right. Freshly back from voting is Melissa. All righty. But it is too fruitful a subject, this of hereditary resemblances, the frequent recurrence of which in a direct line is truly unaccountable, when we consider how large an accumulation of ancestry lies behind every man at the distance of 1 or 2 centuries. We shall only add, therefore, that the Puritan, so at least says chimney corner tradition, which often preserves traits of character with marvelous fidelity, was bold, imperious, relentless, crafty, laying his purposes deep, and following them out with an inveteracy of pursuit that knew neither rest nor conscience, trampling on the weak, and when essential to his ends, doing his utmost to beat down the strong. Whether the judge in any degree resembled him, the further progress of our narrative may show. Scarcely any of the items in the above-drawn parallel occurred to Phoebe, whose country birth and residence, in truth, had left her pitifully ignorant of most of the family traditions, which lingered like cobwebs and incrustations of smoke about the rooms and chimney-corners of the house of the Seven Gables. Yet there was a circumstance, very trifling in itself, which impressed her with an odd degree of horror. She had heard of the anathema flung by Maul, the executed wizard, against Colonel Pinchian and his posterity, that God would give them blood to drink, and likewise of the popular notion that this miraculous blood might now and then be better heard gurgling in their throats. The latter scandal, as became a person of sense, and more especially a member of the Pinchian family, Phoebe had set down for the absurdity which it unquestionably was. But ancient superstitions, after being steeped in human hearts, and embodied in human breath, and passing from lip to ear in manifold repetition through a series of generations, become imbued with an effect of homely truth. The smoke of the domestic hearth has scented them through and through. By long transmission among household facts, they grow to look like them, and have such a familiar way of making themselves at home that their influence is usually greater than we suspect. Thus it happened that when Phoebe heard a certain noise in Judge Pinchian's throat, rather habitual with him, not altogether voluntary, yet indicative of nothing, unless it were a slight bronchial complaint, or, as some people hinted, an apoplectic symptom. When the girl heard this queer and awkward ingurgitation, which the writer never did hear, and therefore cannot describe, she very foolishly started and clasped her hands. Of course, it was exceedingly ridiculous in Phoebe to be discomposed by such a trifle, and still more unpardonable to show her discomposure to the individual most concerned in it, but the incident chimed in so oddly with her previous fancies about the colonel and the judge that, for the moment, it seemed quite to mingle their identity. "What is the matter with you, young woman?" said Judge Pinchian, giving her one of his harsh looks. "Are you afraid of anything?" "Oh, nothing, sir, nothing in the world," answered Phoebe, with a little laugh of vexation at herself. "But perhaps you wish to speak with my cousin, Hepzibah. Shall I call her?" "Stay a moment, if you please," said the judge, again beaming sunshine out of his face. "You seem to be a little nervous this morning. The town air, Cousin Phoebe, does not agree with your good, wholesome country habits. Or has anything happened to disturb you? Anything remarkable in Cousin Hepzibah's family? An arrival, eh? I thought so. No wonder you're out of sorts, my little cousin. To be an inmate with such a guest may well startle an innocent young girl." "You quite puzzle me, sir," replied Phoebe, gazing inquiringly at the judge. "There is no frightful guest in the house, but only a poor, gentle, childlike man, whom I believe to be Cousin Hepzibah's brother. I am afraid, but you, sir, will know better than I, that he is not quite in his sound senses, but so mild and quiet he seems to be, that a mother might trust her baby with him, and I think he would play with the baby as if he were only a few years older than itself. He startle me? Oh, no, indeed." "I rejoice to hear so favorable and so ingenious an account of my cousin Clifford," said the benevolent judge. "Many years ago, when we were boys and young men together, I had a great affection for him, and still feel a tender interest in all his concerns. You say, Cousin Phoebe, he appears to be weak-minded. Heaven grant him at least enough intellect to repent of his past sins."
Nobody, I fancy, observed Phoebe, can have fewer to repent of.
And is it possible, my dear, rejoined the judge with a commiserating look, that you have never heard of Clifford Pincheon? That you know nothing of his history? Well, it is all right. And your mother has shown a very proper regard for the good name of the family with which she connected herself. Believe the best you can of this unfortunate person, and hope for the best. It is a rule which Christians should always follow in their judgments of one another, and especially is it right and wise among near relatives whose characters have necessarily a degree of mutual dependence. But is Clifford in the parlour? I will just step in and see.
Perhaps, sir, I'd better call my cousin Hepzibah, said Phoebe, hardly knowing, however, whether she ought to obstruct the entrance of so affectionate a kinsman into the private regions of the house. Her brother seemed to be just falling asleep after breakfast, and I'm sure she would not like him to be disturbed. Pray, sir, let me give her notice.
But the judge showed a singular determination to enter unannounced, and as Phoebe, with the vivacity of a person whose movements unconsciously answer to her thoughts, had stepped towards the door, he used little or no ceremony in putting her aside. "No, no, Miss Phoebe," said Judge Pincheon, in a voice as deep as a thunder growl, and with a frown as black as the cloud whence it issues. "Stay in here. I know the house, and know my cousin Hepzibah, and know her brother Clifford likewise, nor need my little country cousin put herself to the trouble of announcing me." In these latter words, by the by, there were symptoms of a change from his sudden harshness into the previous benignity of manner. "I am at home here, Phoebe, you must recollect, and you are the stranger. I will just step and see for myself how Clifford is, and assure him and Hepzibah of my kindly feelings and best wishes. It is right at this juncture that they should both hear from my own lips how much I desire to serve them. Here is Hepzibah herself." Such was the case. The vibrations of the judge's voice had reached the old gentlewoman in the parlour, where she sat, with face averted, waiting on her brother's slumber. She now issued forth, as would appear, to defend the entrance, looking, we must needs say, amazingly like the dragon, which in fairy tales is wont to be the guardian over an enchanted beauty. The habitual scowl of her brow was undeniably too fierce at this moment to pass itself off on the innocent score of near-sightedness, and it was bent on Judge Pincheon in a way that seemed to confound, if not alarm him, so inadequately had he estimated the moral force of a deeply grounded antipathy. She made a repelling character, even now, developed itself in a quick tremor, which to her own perception set each of her joints at variance with its fellows. Possibly the judge was aware how little true hardihood lay behind Hepzibah's formidable front. At any rate, being a gentleman of steady nerves, he soon recovered himself, and failed not to approach his cousin with outstretched hand, adopting the sensible precaution, however, to cover his advance with a smile, so broad and sultry that, had it been only half as warm as it looked, a trellis of grapes might at once have turned purple under its summer-like exposure. It may have been his purpose, indeed, to melt poor Hepzibah on the spot, as if she were a figure of yellow wax. "Hepzibah, my beloved cousin, I am rejoiced," exclaimed the judge most emphatically. "Now, at length, you have something to live for. Yes, and all of us, let me say, your friends and kindred, have more to live for than we have had yesterday. I have lost no time in hastening to offer any assistance in my power towards making Clifford comfortable. He belongs to us all. I know how much he requires, how much he used to require, with his delicate taste and his love of the beautiful. Anything in my house, pictures, books, wine, luxuries of the table, he may command them all. It would afford me most heartfelt gratification to see him. Shall I step in this moment?"
"No,"
replied Hepzibah, her voice quivering too painfully to allow of many words.
He cannot see visitors."
"A visitor, my dear cousin? Do you call me so?" cried the judge, whose sensibility, it seems, was hurt by the coldness of the phrase. "Nay, then, let me be Clifford's host, and your own likewise. Come at once to my house. The country air and all the conveniences, I may say luxuries, that I have gathered about me will do wonders for him. And you and I, dear Hepzibah, will consult together and watch together and labor together to make our dear Clifford happy. Come, why should we make more words about what is both a duty and a pleasure on my part? Come to me at once." On hearing these so hospitable offers, and such generous recognition of the claims of kindred, Phoebe felt very much in the mood of running up to Judge Pincheon, and giving him, of her own accord, the kiss from which she had so recently shrunk away. It was quite otherwise with Hepzibah. The judge's smile seemed to operate on her acerbity of heart like sunshine upon vinegar, making it 10 times sourer than ever.
"Clifford,"
said she, still too agitated to utter more than an abrupt sentence,
"Clifford has a home here."
"May heaven forgive you, Hepzibah," said Judge Pincheon, reverently lifting his eyes towards that high court of equity to which he appealed, "if you suffer any ancient prejudice or animosity to weigh with you in this matter. I stand here with an open heart, willing and anxious to receive yourself and Clifford into it. Do not refuse my good offices, my earnest propositions for your welfare. They are such, in all respects, as it behooves your nearest kinsman to make. It will be a heavy responsibility, cousin, if you confine your brother to this dismal house and stifled air, when the delightful freedom of my country seat is at his command."
"It would never suit Clifford,"
said Hepzibah, as briefly as before. "Woman," broke forth the judge, giving way to his resentment, "what is the meaning of all this? Have you other resources? Nay, I suspected as much. Take care, Hepzibah, take care. Clifford is on the brink of as black a ruin as ever befell him yet. But why do I talk with you, woman as you are? Make way, I must see Clifford." Hepzibah spread out her gaunt figure across the door, then seemed really to increase in bulk, looking the more terrible also, because there was so much terror and agitation in her heart. But Judge Pincheon's evident purpose of forcing a passage was interrupted by a voice from the inner room, a weak, tremulous, wailing voice, indicating helpless alarm, with no more energy for self-defense than belongs to a frightened infant.
"Hepzibah, Hepzibah," cried the voice, "go down on your knees to him, kiss his feet, entreat him not to come in. Oh, let him have mercy on me. Mercy, mercy."
For the instant it appeared doubtful whether it were not for the judge's resolute purpose to set Hepzibah aside, and step across the threshold into the parlour, whence issued that broken and miserable murmur of entreaty. It was not pity that restrained him, for at the first sound of the enfeebled voice a red fire kindled in his eyes, and he made a quick pace forward, with something inexpressibly fierce and grim darkening forth, as it were, out of the whole man. To know Judge Pincheon was to see him at that moment. After such a revelation, let him smile with what sultriness he would. He could much sooner turn grapes purple or pumpkins yellow than melt the iron-branded impression out of the beholder's memory. And it rendered his aspect not the less, but more frightful, that it seemed not to express wrath or hatred, but a certain hot fellness of purpose which annihilated everything but itself. Yet, after all, are we not slandering an excellent and amiable man? Look at the judge now. He is apparently conscious of having erred in too energetically pressing his deeds of loving kindness on persons unable to appreciate them. He will await their better mood, and hold himself as ready to assist them then as at this moment.
As he draws back from the door, an all-comprehensive benignity blazes from his visage, indicating that he gathers Hepzibah, little Phoebe, and the invisible Clifford, all three, together with the whole world besides, into his immense heart, and gives them a warm bath in its flood of affection. "You do me great wrong, dear cousin Hepzibah," said he, first kindly offering her his hand, then drawing on his glove preparatory to departure. "Very great wrong, but I forgive it, and will study to make you think better of me. Of course our poor Clifford, being in so unhappy a state of mind, I cannot think of urging an interview at present, but I shall watch over his welfare as if he were my own beloved brother. Nor do I at all despair, my dear cousin, of constraining both him and you to acknowledge your injustice. When that shall happen, I desire no other revenge than your acceptance of the best offices in my power to do you." With a bow to Hepzibah, and a degree of paternal benevolence in his parting nod to Phoebe, the judge left the shop, and went smiling along the street. As is customary with the rich, when they aim at the honors of a republic, he apologized, as it were, to the people, for his wealth, prosperity, and elevated station, by a free and hearty manner towards those who knew him, putting off the more of his dignity in due proportion with the humbleness of the man whom he saluted, and thereby proving a haughty consciousness of his advantages as irrefragably as if he had marched forth preceded by a troop of lackeys to clear the way. On this particular forenoon, so excessive was the warmth of Judge Pincheon's kindly aspect, that, such at least was the rumor about town, an extra passage of the water carts was found essential in order to lay the dust occasioned by so much extra sunshine. No sooner had he disappeared than Hepzibah grew deadly white, and, staggering towards Phoebe, let her head fall on the young girl's shoulder. "Oh, Phoebe," murmured she, "that man has been the horror of my life. Shall I never, never have the courage? Will my voice never cease from trembling long enough to let me tell him what he is?" "Is he so very wicked?" asked Phoebe. "Yet his offers were surely kind." "Do not speak of them. He has a heart of iron," rejoined Hepzibah. "Go now, and talk to Clifford. Amuse and keep him quiet. It would disturb him wretchedly to see me so agitated as I am. There, go, dear child, and I will try to look after the shop." Phoebe went accordingly, but perplexed herself, meanwhile, with queries as to the purport of the scene which she had just witnessed, and also whether judges, clergymen, and other characters of that eminent stamp and respectability could really, in any single instance, be otherwise than just and upright men. A doubt of this nature has a most disturbing influence, and if shown to be a fact, comes with fearful and startling effect on minds of the trim, orderly, and limit-loving class, in which we find our little country girl. Dispositions more boldly speculative may derive a stern enjoyment from the discovery, since there must be evil in the world, that a high man is as likely to grasp his share of it as a low one. A wider scope of view and a deeper insight may see rank, dignity, and station all proved illusory, so far as regards their claim to human reverence, and yet not feel as if the universe was thereby tumbling headlong into chaos. But Phoebe, in order to keep the universe in its old place, was fain to smother, in some degree, her own intuitions as to Judge Pincheon's character. And as for her cousin's testimony, in disparagement of it, she concluded that Hepzibah's judgment was embittered by one of those family feuds which render hatred the more deadly by the dead and corrupted love that they intermingle with its native poison. Okay, so that was an interesting chapter. Okay, it was really like a long introduction.
to the Judge Pinchian. To the Judge Pinchian. The on the surface, an okay gentleman, but obviously up to no good, at least according to Hepzibah. So, and he has an unusual interest in Clifford, a very unusual interest in Clifford. Oh, don't forget, if you are enjoying this stream here, well, actually, well, first of all, let me say hello to anyone who might be new here. Yeah, we're reading this live. It's not rehearsed. It's in a lot of ways I do this to help me get better at cold reading. And boy, Nathaniel Hawthorne sure is challenging with a lot of his things. Yeah, so we'll be stopping from time to time to look up words, strange words. He uses a lot that I don't know. And sometimes we'll be stumbling over some extra long sentences or the like, or just boy, he's got a real turn of phrase in a lot of his writing there. So sometimes we need to backtrack a little bit there and start again. So yeah, if you're we learn as we go. That's the whole point of the exercise here, and we get to share a story with you. So if you're new, we do this 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, here on YouTube, and then again on Sundays we have a different show on Twitch, and the links are below if you need to find them. But yeah, a Sunday show, Short Story Sunday, just reading short stories, poems. Sometimes we get pieces written by people like you. If you are a creative writer, I'm happy to read a short story that you have written that you might want to share with a live audience. I do that on Sundays, but that's over on Twitch. Yeah. But in the meantime, Monday through Thursday, right here. Chapter 9. Clifford and Phoebe. Truly was there something high, generous, and knowable in the native composition of our poor old Hepzibah. Or else, and it was quite probably the case, she had been enriched by poverty, developed by sorrow, elevated by the strong and solitary affection of her life, and thus endowed with heroism, which never could have characterized her in what are called happier circumstances. Through dreary years, Hepzibah had looked forward, for the most part despairingly, never with any confidence of hope, but always with the feeling that it was her brightest possibility, to the very position in which she now found herself. In her own behalf, she had asked nothing of Providence but the opportunity of devoting herself to this brother, whom she had so loved, so admired for what he was, or might have been, and to whom she had kept her faith, alone of all the world, wholly, unfalteringly, at every instant, and throughout life. And here, in his late decline, the lost one had come back out of his long and strange misfortune, and was thrown on her sympathy, as it seemed, not merely for the bread of his physical existence, but for everything that should keep him morally alive. She had responded to the call. She had come forward, our poor, gaunt Hepzibah, in her rusty silks, with her rigid joints, and the sad perversity of her scowl, ready to do her utmost, and with affection enough, if that were all, to do 100 times as much. There could be few more tearful sights, and heaven forgive us if a smile insist on mingling with our conception of it. Few sights with truer pathos in them than Hepzibah presented on that first afternoon. How patiently did she endeavor to wrap Clifford up in her great warm love, and make it all the world to him, so that he should retain no torturing sense of the coldness and dreariness without. Her little efforts to amuse him, how pitiful, yet magnanimous were they. Remembering his early love of poetry and fiction, she unlocked a bookcase and took down several books that had been excellent reading in their day. There was a volume of Pope, with The Rape of the Lock in it, and another of the Tatler, and an odd one of Dryden's Miscellanies, all with tarnished gilding on their covers,
and thoughts of tarnished brilliancy inside. They had no success with Clifford. These and all such writers of society, whose new works glow like the rich texture of a just-woven carpet, must be content to relinquish their charm for every reader after an age or two, and could hardly be supposed to retain any portion of it for a mind that had utterly lost its estimate of modes and manners. Hepzibah then took up Rasselas and began to read of the Happy Valley with a vague idea that some secret of a contented life had there been elaborated, which might at least serve Clifford and herself for this one day. But the Happy Valley had a cloud over it. Hepzibah troubled her auditor, moreover, by innumerable sins of emphasis, which he seemed to detect without any reference to the meaning. Nor, in fact, did he appear to take much note of the sense of what she read, but evidently felt the tedium of the lecture, without harvesting its profit. His sister's voice, too, naturally harsh, had in the course of her sorrowful lifetime contracted a kind of croak, which, when it once gets into the human throat, is as ineradicable When it gets into the human throat, it is as ineradicable as sin. In both senses, occasionally, this lifelong croak, accompanying each word of joy or sorrow, is one of the symptoms of a settled melancholy, and wherever it occurs, the whole history of misfortune is conveyed in its slightest accent. The effect is as if the voice had been dyed black, or, if we must use a more moderate simile, this miserable croak, running through all the variations of the voice, is like a black silken thread, on which the crystal beads of speech are strung, and whence they take their hue. Such voices have put on mourning for dead hopes, and they ought to die, and be buried along with them. Discerning that Clifford was not gladdened by her efforts, Hepzibah searched about the house for the means of more exhilarating pastime. At one time her eyes chanced to rest on Alice Pyncheon's harpsichord. It was a moment of great peril, for, despite the traditionary awe that had gathered over this instrument of music, and the dirges which spiritual fingers were said to play on it, the devoted sister had solemn thoughts of thrumming on its chords for Clifford's benefit, and accompanying the performance with her voice. Poor Clifford! Poor Hepzibah! Poor harpsichord! All three would have been miserable together. By some good agency, possibly by the unrecognized interposition of the long-buried Alice herself, the threatening calamity was averted. But the worst of all, the hardest stroke of fate for Hepzibah to endure, and perhaps for Clifford too, was his invincible distaste for her appearance. Her features, never the most agreeable, and now harsh with age and grief, and resentment against the world for his sake. Her dress, and especially her turban, the queer and quaint manners which had unconsciously grown upon her in solitude, such being the poor gentlewoman's outward characteristics, it is no great marvel, although the mournfulest of pities, that the instinctive lover of the beautiful was fain to turn away his eyes. There was no help for it. It would be the latest impulse to die within him. In his last extremity, the expiring breath stealing faintly through Clifford's lips, he would doubtless press Hepzibah's hand in fervent recognition of all her lavished love, and close his eyes, but not so much to die, as to be constrained to look no longer on her face. Poor Hepzibah! She took counsel with herself what might be done, and thought of putting ribbons on her turban, but by the instant rush of several guardian angels was withheld from an experiment that could hardly have proved less than fatal to the beloved object of her anxiety. Okay, we're just going to stop here for a second. What is up with her turban? I don't think that was ever explained why before, but it's been mentioned several times, very prominently, and now it's like it's almost like a centerpiece of her character. So there's got to be a reason why she's like decked out in this turban all the time. I suppose it'll be revealed later, but yeah, it's just keeps getting mentioned over and over. But I don't recall. I don't recall anything actually talking about it. All right. To be brief, besides Hepzibah's disadvantages of person, there was an uncouthness pervading all her deeds, a clumsy something that could but ill adapt itself for use, and not at all for ornament. She was a grief to Clifford, and she knew it. In this extremity, the antiquated virgin turned to Phoebe. No grovelling jealousy was in her heart. Had it pleased heaven to crown the heroic fidelity of her life by making her personally the medium of Clifford's happiness, it would have rewarded her for all the past by a joy with no bright tints, indeed, but deep and true, and worth 1,000 gayer ecstasies. This could not be. She therefore turned to Phoebe, and resigned the task into the young girl's hands. The latter took it up cheerfully, as she did everything, but with no sense of a mission to perform, and succeeding all the better for that same simplicity. By the involuntary effect of a genial temperament, Phoebe soon grew to be absolutely essential to the daily comfort, if not the daily life, of her two forlorn companions. The grime and sordidness of the house of the Seven Gables seemed to have vanished since her appearance there. The gnawing tooth of the dry rot was stayed among the old timbers of its skeleton frame. The dust had ceased to settle down so densely from the antique ceilings upon the floors and furniture of the rooms below. Or, at any rate, there was a little housewife, as light-footed as the breeze that sweeps a garden walk, gliding hither and thither to brush it all away. The shadows of gloomy events that haunted the else lonely and desolate apartments, the heavy, breathless scent which death had left in more than one of the bedchambers ever since his visits of long ago, these were less powerful than the purifying influence scattered throughout the atmosphere of the household by the presence of one youthful, fresh, and thoroughly wholesome heart. There was no morbidness in Phoebe. If there had been, the old Pincian house was the very locality to ripen it into incurable disease. But now her spirit resembled, in its potency, a minute quantity of ottar of rose in one of Hepzibah's huge iron-bound trunks, diffusing its fragrance through the various articles of linen and wrought lace, kerchiefs, caps, stockings, folded dresses, gloves, and whatever else was treasured there. As every article in the great trunk was the sweeter for the rose scent, so did all the thoughts and emotions of Hepzibah and Clifford, sombre as they might seem, acquire a subtle attribute of happiness from Phoebe's intermixture with them. Her activity of body, intellect, and heart impelled her continually to perform the ordinary little toils that offered themselves around her, and to think the thought proper for the moment, and to sympathize, now with the twittering gaiety of the robins in the pear-tree, and now to such a depth as she could with Hepzibah's dark anxiety, or the vague moan of her brother. This facile adaptation was at once the symptom of perfect health and its best preservative. A nature like Phoebe's has invariably its due influence, but is seldom regarded with due honor. Its spiritual force, however, may be partially estimated by the fact of her having found a place for herself, amid circumstances so stern as those which surrounded the mistress of the house, and also by the effect which she produced on a character of so much more mass than her own. For the gaunt, bony frame and limbs of Hepzibah as compared with the tiny lightsomeness of Phoebe's figure, were perhaps in some fit proportion with the moral weight and substance, respectively, of the woman and the girl. To the guest, to Hepzibah's brother, or cousin Clifford, as Phoebe now began to call him, she was especially necessary. Not that he could ever be said to converse with her, or often manifest in any other very definite mode his sense of a charm in her society. But if she were a long while absent, he became pettish and nervously restless, pacing the room to and fro with the uncertainty that characterized all his movements, or else would sit broodingly in his great chair, resting his head on his hands, and evincing life only by an electric sparkle of ill humor, whenever Hepzibah endeavored to arouse him. Phoebe's presence and the Phoebe's presence and the contiguity of her fresh life to his blighted one was usually all that he required. Indeed, such was the native gush and play of her spirit that she was seldom perfectly quiet and undemonstrative, any more than a fountain ever ceases to dimple and warble with its flow. She possessed the gift of song, and that too so naturally that you would as little think of inquiring whence she had caught it, or what master had taught her, as of asking the same question about a bird in whose small strain of music we recognize the voice of the Creator as distinctly as in the loudest accents of his thunder. So long as Phoebe sang, she might stray at her own will about the house. Clifford was content whether the sweet, airy homeliness of her tones came down from the upper chambers or along the passageway from the shop, or was sprinkled through the foliage of the pear-tree, inward from the garden with the twinkling sunbeams. He would sit quietly, with a gentle pleasure gleaming over his face, brighter now, and now a little dimmer, as the song happened to float near him, or was more remotely heard. It pleased him best, however, when she sat on a low footstool at his knee. "Hey there, Rose. It's good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, it's okay. We're glad you're able to make it. What have you missed so far? Well, we started on chapter 8, I believe it was. We were introduced to another Pinchian relative who arrived at the house to visit, who got turned away. The Judge Pinchian, who's for some reason Hepzibah really dislikes him, but he pretends to be a very friendly character. And so Hepzibah just tossed him out, and he has a very unnatural interest in Clifford for some reason. And we're learning about Clifford right now with how Phoebe interacts with him. Yeah, that's right. It is perhaps remarkable, considering her temperament, that Phoebe oftener chose a strain of pathos than of gaiety. But the young and happy are not ill-pleased to temper their life with a transparent shadow. The deepest pathos of Phoebe's voice and song, moreover, came sifted through the golden texture of a cheery spirit, and was somehow so interfused with the quality thence acquired that one's heart felt all the lighter for having wept at it. Broad mirth in the sacred presence of dark misfortune would have jarred harshly and irreverently with the solemn symphony that rolled its undertone through Hepzibah's and her brother's life. Therefore it was well that Phoebe so often chose sad themes, and not amiss that they ceased to be so sad while she was singing them. Becoming habituated to her companionship, Clifford readily showed how capable of imbibing pleasant tints and gleams of cheerful light from all quarters his nature must have originally have been. He grew youthful while she sat by him, a beauty, not precisely real, even in its utmost manifestation, and which a painter would have watched long to seize and fix upon his canvas, and after all, in vain. Beauty, nevertheless, that was not a mere dream, would sometimes play upon and illuminate his face. It did more than to illuminate. It transfigured him with an expression that could only be interpreted as the glow of an exquisite and happy spirit. That grey hair and those furrows, with their record of infinite sorrow, so deeply written across his brow, and so compressed as with a futile effort to crowd in all the tale, that the whole inscription was made illegible. These, for the moment, vanished. An eye at once tender and acute might have beheld in the man some shadow of what he was meant to be. Anon, as age came stealing, like a sad twilight, back over his figure, you would have felt tempted to hold an argument with destiny, and affirm that either this being should not have been made mortal, or mortal existence should have been tempered to his qualities. There seemed no necessity for having his drawn breath at all. The world never wanted him, but as he had breathed, it ought always to have been the balmiest of summer air. The same perplexity will invariably haunt us with regards to natures that tend to feed exclusively upon the beautiful, let their earthly fate be as lenient as it may. Phoebe, it is probable, had but a very imperfect comprehension of the character over which she had thrown so beneficent a spell. Nor was it necessary. The fire upon the hearth can gladden a whole semicircle of faces round about it, but need not know the individuality of one among them all. Indeed, there was something too fine and delicate in Clifford's traits to be perfectly appreciated by one whose sphere lay so much in the actual as Phoebe's did. For Clifford, however, the reality and simplicity and thorough homeliness of the girl's nature were as powerful a charm as any that she possessed. Beauty, it is true, and beauty almost perfect in its own style, was indispensable. Had Phoebe been coarse in feature, shaped clumsily, of a harsh voice, and uncouthly mannered, she might have been rich with all good gifts beneath this unfortunate exterior. And still, so long as she wore the guise of woman, she would have shocked Clifford and depressed him by her lack of beauty. But nothing more beautiful, nothing prettier, at least, was ever made than Phoebe. And therefore, to this man, whose whole poor and impalpable enjoyment of existence heretofore, and until both his heart and fancy died within him, had been a dream, whose images of women had more and more lost their warmth and substance, and had been frozen, like the pictures of secluded artists, into the chillest ideality. To him, this little figure of the cheeriest household life was just what he required to bring him back into the breathing world. Persons who have wandered or been expelled out of the common track of things, even were it for a better system, desire nothing so much as to be led back. They shiver in their loneliness, be it on a mountain top or in a dungeon. Now Phoebe's presence made a home about her, that very sphere which the outcast, the prisoner, the potentate, the wretch beneath mankind, the wretch aside from it, or the wretch above it, instinctively pines after. A home. She was real. Holding her hand you felt something, a tender something, a substance and a warm one, and so long as you should feel its grasp, soft as it was, you might be certain that your place was good in the whole sympathetic chain of human nature. The world was no longer a delusion. By looking a little further in this direction, we might suggest an explanation of an often suggested mystery. Why are poets so apt to choose their mates, not for any similarity of poetic endowment, but for qualities which might make the happiness of the rudest handicraftsman, as well as that of the ideal craftsman of the spirit? Because, probably, at his highest elevation, the poet needs no human intercourse, but he finds it dreary to descend and be a stranger. There was something very beautiful in the relation that grew up between this pair, so closely and constantly linked together, yet with such a waste of gloomy and mysterious years from his birthday to hers. On Clifford's part, it was the feeling of a man naturally endowed with the liveliest sensibility to feminine influence, but who had never quaffed the cup of passionate love, and knew that it was now too late. He knew it with the instinctive delicacy that had survived his intellectual decay. Thus his sentiment for Phoebe, without being paternal, was not less chaste than if she had been his daughter. He was a man, it is true, and recognized her as a woman. She was his only representative of womankind. He took unfailing note of every charm that appertained to her sex, and saw the ripeness of her lips, and the virginal development of her bosom. All her little womanly ways, budding out of her like blossoms on a young fruit-tree, had their effect on him, and sometimes caused his very heart to tingle with the keenest thrills of pleasure. At such moments, for the effect was seldom more than momentary, the half-torpid man would be full of harmonious life, just as a long silent harp is full of sound, when the musician's fingers sweep across it. But, after all, it seemed rather a perception, or a sympathy, than a sentiment belonging to himself as an individual. He read Phoebe as he would a sweet and simple story. He listened to her as if she were a verse of household poetry, which God, in requital of his bleak and dismal lot, had permitted some angel, that most pitied him, to warble through the house. She was not an actual fact for him, but the interpretation of all that he lacked on earth brought warmly home to his conception, so that this mere symbol, or lifelike picture, had almost the comfort of reality. But we strive in vain to put the idea into words. No adequate expression of the beauty and profound pathos with which it impresses us is attainable. This being, made only for this being, made only for happiness, and heretofore so miserably failing to be happy, his tendencies so hideously thwarted, that some unknown time ago the delicate springs of his character, never morally or intellectually strong, had given way, and he was now imbecile, this poor forlorn voyager from the islands of the blest, in a frail bark, on a tempestuous sea, had been flung by the last mountain wave of his shipwreck into a quiet harbor. There, as he lay more than half lifeless on the strand, the fragrance of an earthly rosebud had come to his nostrils, and, as odors will, had summoned up reminiscences or visions of all the living and breathing beauty amid which he should have had his home. With his native susceptibility of happy influences, he inhales the slight, ethereal rapture into his soul, and expires. And how did Phoebe regard Clifford? The girl's was not one of those natures which are most attracted by what is strange and exceptional in human character. The path which would best have suited her was the well-worn track of ordinary life. The companions in whom she would most have delighted were such as one encounters at every turn. The mystery which enveloped Clifford, so far as it affected her at all, was an annoyance rather than the piquant charm which many women might have found in it. Still, her native kindliness was brought strongly into play, not by what was darkly picturesque in his situation, nor so much even by the finer graces of his character, as by the simple appeal of a heart so forlorn as his to one so full of genuine sympathy as hers. She gave him an affectionate regard, because he needed so much love, and seemed to have received so little. With a ready tact, the result of ever active and wholesome sensibility, she discerned what was good for him, and did it. Whatever was morbid in his mind and experience she ignored, and thereby kept their intercourse healthy, by the incautious, but, as it were, heaven-directed freedom of her whole conduct. The sick in mind, and perhaps in body, are rendered more darkly and hopelessly so by the manifold reflection of their disease mirrored back from all quarters in the deportment of those about them. They are compelled to inhale the poison of their own breath in infinite repetition. But Phoebe afforded her patient a supply of purer air. She impregnated it, too, not with a wild flower scent, for wildness was no trait of hers, but with the perfume of garden roses, pinks, and other blossoms of much sweetness, which nature and man have consented together in making grow from summer to summer, and from century to century. Such a flower was Phoebe in her relation with Clifford, and such the delight that he inhaled from her. Man. Yet, it must be said, her petals sometimes drooped a little in consequence of the heavy atmosphere about her. She grew more thoughtful than heretofore. Looking aside at Clifford's face, and seeing the dim, unsatisfactory elegance, and the intellect almost quenched, she would try to inquire what had been his life. Was he always thus? Had this veil been over him from his birth? This veil under which far more of his spirit was hidden than revealed, and through which he so imperfectly discerned the actual world? Or was it its grey texture woven of some dark calamity? Phoebe loved no riddles, and would have been glad to escape the perplexity of this one. Nevertheless, there was so far a good result of her meditations on Clifford's character, that when her Nevertheless, there was so far a good result of her meditations on Clifford's character, that when her involuntary conjectures, together with the tendency of every strange circumstance to tell its own story, had gradually taught her the fact, it had no terrible effect upon her. Let the world have done him what vast wrong it might, she knew cousin Clifford too well, or fancied so, ever to shudder at the touch of his thin, delicate fingers. Yeah, I've been seeing some pictures there, Scorpion Knights, of all the new Minecraft stuff. Yeah. We should do a Minecraft tours fairly soon. Within a few days after the appearance of this remarkable inmate, the routine of life had established itself with a good deal of uniformity in the old house of our narrative. In the morning, very shortly after breakfast, it was Clifford's custom to fall asleep in his chair, nor, unless accidentally disturbed, would he emerge from a dense cloud of slumber, or the thinner mists that flitted to and fro, until well towards noonday. These hours of drowsy head were the season of the old gentlewoman's attendance on her brother, while Phoebe took charge of the shop, an arrangement which the public speedily understood, and evinced their decided preference of the younger shopwoman by the multiplicity of their calls during her administration of affairs. Dinner over, Hepzibah took her knitting work, a long stocking of grey yarn, for her brother's winter wear, and with a sigh and a scowl of affectionate farewell to Clifford, and a gesture enjoining watchfulness on Phoebe, went to take her seat behind the counter. It was now the young girl's turn to be the nurse, the guardian, the playmate, or whatever is the fitter phrase, of the grey-haired man. Man, it is taking a while to get introduced to all these characters. We're 45% of the way in, and just today we've just met Judge Pinchian. An entire chapter just describing him. Still don't know about Clifford, really. I mean, like we've met him. Just had a chapter detailing Phoebe's interaction with him. Man, setting these characters up, man, it's taken a while. So that was chapters 8 and 9. 8 and 9. The House of the Seven Gables, yeah. We'll continue on Monday. Yeah, this is our Monday through Thursday show, yeah. So Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We usually go for about 2 hours, sometimes a little longer. We do have 25 minutes left. That's not going to be enough to get through another chapter of this, though. So we're going to switch on over to a little Lord Dunsany. We're slowly working our way through Time and the Gods, collection of short stories there. But man, very, very, very verbose is Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Good gracious. A lot of stuff to stumble over. Let's see, how are we doing here? Yeah, so let's So like I said, we are switching over to just a couple of short stories to bring us to the top of the hour. Our next live stream for books is on Sunday. Short Story Sunday is coming up. I do that on Twitch, though. You can find a link down below if you need that. Sundays, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And I read short stories, poems, and if you are a creative writer and have a short story to share, I'm more than happy to read it for our live audience over there on Twitch. But yeah, we'll be back with The House of the Seven Gables on Monday here on YouTube. Here is Time and the Gods. Time and the Gods. It's very difficult to read aloud, Anya. Very difficult. Boy, very, very challenging stuff. It is. I mean, it's not. It's not often I stumble so often while reading, or like sometimes you'll even get like halfway through like a paragraph of a sentence, and there's just like so many additional clauses in it that you'll like lose track of what the actual main sentence is before it gets to the very final clause. It's challenging. Okay. So here we go. This one here, a little piece called Night and Morning by Lord Dunsany. This is from his Time and the Gods collection of short stories. All set in Pagania. Yeah. BW says it's a roller coaster of tongue twisting. Indeed it is. It is. And here's the thing. It's so much easier to read in your head. But yeah, if just reading it out, like especially as a cold read, man. Yeah, it's tough. It's okay. Night and Morning. Once in an arbor of the gods, above the fields of twilight, Night, wandering alone, came suddenly on Morning. Then Night drew from his face his cloak of dark grey mists, and said, "See, I am Night." And they two, sitting in that arbor of the gods, Night told wondrous stories of old mysterious happenings in the dark. And Morning sat and wondered, gazing into the face of Night and at his wreath of stars. And Morning told how the rains of Snarmathus smoked in the plain, but Night told how Snarmathus held riot in the dark, with revelry and drinking, and tales told by kings, till all the hosts of Meenath crept against it, and the lights went out, and there arose the din of arms, or ever morning came. And Night told how Sindana, the beggar, had dreamed that he was a king, and Morning told how she had seen Sindana find suddenly an army in the plain, and how he had gone to it, thinking he was king, and the army had believed him, and Sindana now ruled over Marthas, and Targadrides, Dinath, Zan, and Tomida. And most night loved to tell of Asarnes, whose ruins are scant memories on the desert's edge. But morning told of the twin cities of Nardis and Timaut that lorded over the plain. And night told terribly of what Mynandes found when he walked through his own city in the dark. And ever at the elbow of regal night whispers arose, saying, "Tell morning this." And ever night told, and ever morning wondered. And night spake on, and told what the dead had done when they came in the darkness on the king that had led them into battle once. And night knew who slew Darnex, and how it was done. Moreover, he told why the 7 kings tortured Sedatharus, and what Sedatharus said just at the last, and how the kings went forth and took their lives. And night told whose blood had stained the marble steps that lead to the temple in Ozan, and why the skull within it wears a golden crown, and whose soul is in the wolf that howls in the dark against the city. And night knew whither the tigers go out of the Eurasian desert, and the place where they meet together, and who speaks to them, and what she says, and why. And he told why human teeth had bitten the iron hinge in the great gate that swings in the walls of Mondaz, and who came up out of the marsh alone in the dark time, and demanded audience of the king, and told the king a lie, and how the king, believing it, went down into the vaults of his palace, and found only toads and snakes, who slew the king. And he told of ventures in palace towers in the quiet, and knew the spell whereby a man might send the light of the moon right into the soul of his foe. And night spoke of the forest, and the stirring of shadows, and soft feet pattering, and peering eyes, and of the fear that sits behind the trees, taking to itself the shape of something crouched to spring. But far under that arbor of the gods, down on the earth, the mountain peak Mondana looked morning in the eyes, and forsook his allegiance to night. And one by one, the lesser hills about Mondana's knees greeted the morning, and all the while, in the plains, the shapes of cities came looming out of the dusk. And Congros stood forth with all her pinnacles, and the winged figure of Posey carved upon the eastern portal of her gate, and the squat figure of Avarice carved facing it upon the west. And the bat began to tire of going up and down her streets, and already the owl was home, and the dark lions went up out of the plain, back to their caves again. Not as yet shone any dew upon the spider's snare, nor came the sound of any insects stirring, or bird of the day, and full allegiance all the valleys owned still to their lord the night. Yet earth was preparing for another ruler, and kingdom by kingdom she stole away from night, and there marched through the dreams of men 1,000,000 heralds that cried with the voice of the cock, "Lo, morning come behind us!" But in that arbor of the gods, above the fields of twilight, the star wreath was paling about the head of night, and ever more wonderful on morning's brow appeared the mark of power. And at the moment when the camp fires pale, and the smoke goes grey to the sky, and camels sniff the dawn, suddenly morning forgot night. And out of that arbour of the gods, and away to the haunts of the dark, night with his swart cloak slunk away. And morning placed her hand upon the mists, and drew them upward, and revealed the earth, and drove the shadows before her, and they followed night. And suddenly the mystery quitted haunting shapes, and an old glamour was gone, and far and wide over the fields of earth a new splendor arose. Yeah. All right. Yeah, okay, I like that. Yeah. Okay. That was pretty good. I like that one. Yeah, we got time for one more, I guess. We'll just switch back on over to our, boy, oh boy. Little claws and big claws. I think this is Hans Christian Andersen, this one here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 9, 20, 1, 2. Oh boy, that'll be long. These are long ones. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Princess and the Pea. Sean. Yeah, just flipping through for something reasonable. Little tiny or Thumbelina. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Something short. The Saucy Boy. The Saucy Boy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's try this one. The Saucy Boy. The Saucy Boy. By Hans Christian Andersen. Okay. Once upon a time, there was an old poet, one of those right good old poets. One evening, as he was sitting at home, there was a terrible storm going on outside. The rain was pouring down, but the old poet sat comfortably in his chimney corner, where the fire was burning and the apples were roasting. "There will not be a dry thread left on the poor people who are out in this weather," he said. "Oh, open the door! I'm so cold and wet through," called a little child outside. It was crying and knocking at the door whilst the rain was pouring down, and the wind was rattling all the windows. "Oh, poor creature," said the poet, and got up and opened the door. Before him stood a little boy. He was naked, and the water flowed from his long fair locks. He was shivering with cold. If he had not been let in, he certainly would have perished in the storm. "Oh, poor little thing," said the poet, and took him by the hand. "Come to me. I will soon warm you. You shall have some wine and an apple, for you are such a pretty boy." That would not go over well these days. Some naked little chap showing up at your door as I come on in and have a glass of wine. All right. And he was, too. His eyes sparkled like two bright stars, and although the water flowed down from his fair locks, they still curled quite beautifully. He looked like a little angel, but was pale with cold and trembling all over. In his hand he held a splendid bow, but it had been entirely spoilt by the rain, and the colours of the pretty arrows had run into one another by getting wet. The old man sat down by the fire, and taking the little boy on his knee, wrung the water out of his locks and warmed his hands in his own. He then made him some hot spiced wine, which quickly revived him, so that with reddening cheeks he sprang upon the floor and danced around the old man. "You are a merry boy," said the latter. "What is your name?" "My name is Cupid," he answered. "Don't you know me? There lies my bow. I shoot with that, you know. Look, the weather's getting fine again. The moon is shining." But your bow is spoiled," said the old poet. "That would be unfortunate," said the little boy, taking it up and looking at it. "Oh, it's quite dry and isn't damaged at all. The string is quite tight. I'll try it." So, drawing it back, he took an arrow, aimed, and shot the good old poet right in the heart. "Do you see now that my bow was not spoiled?" he said, and, loudly laughing, ran away. What a naughty boy to shoot the old poet like that, who had taken him into his warm room, had been so good to him, and had given him the nicest wine and the best apple. The good old man lay upon the floor, crying. He was really shot in the heart. "Oh," he cried, "what a naughty boy this Cupid is! I shall tell all the good children about this, so that they take care never to play with him, lest he hurt them." And all good children, both girls and boys, whom he told about this, were on their guard against wicked Cupid. But he deceives them all the same, for he is very deep. When the students come out of class, he walks beside them, with a book under his arm, and wearing a black coat. They cannot recognize him. And then, if they take him by the arm, believing him to be a student too, he sticks an arrow into their chest. And when the girls go to church to be confirmed, he is amongst them too. In fact, he is always after people. He sits in the large chandelier in the theatre and blazes away, so that people think it is a lamp. But they soon find out their mistake. He walks about in the castle garden and on the promenades. Yes, once he shot your father and your mother in the heart too. Just ask them, and you will hear what they say. Oh, he's a bad boy, this Cupid, and you must never have anything to do with him, for he is after everyone. Just think, he even shot an arrow at old grandmother. But that was a long time ago. The wound has long been healed, but such things are never forgotten. Now you know what a bad boy this wicked Cupid is. That was kind of silly. That was kind of silly. Very silly, in fact. That's okay. That's a short little bit by that. Okay, after all that, we still got time for one more. Let me just pull up something here real fast. Boom. There we go. I'm gonna pull this up here real fast. Up we come. It's gonna do something really short. Well, I've read this one before, not here on YouTube's. Just a little bit from Mr. What is What the Moon? Yeah, What the Moon Brings. Yeah, sure, why not? It's a Valentine's Day story. It was very tongue in cheek, very tongue in cheek. All right. Rose Morales is all about the encore. Very good. Yeah. Man, I need a more comfy seat if I need to keep doing these encores. Alrighty, here we go. Okay, so we got a little piece of H.P. Lovecraft is going to be our a little thing to end the night with. I've read this one before. It's one of my favorites. It should be pretty good. What the Moon Brings. Before we get into it, just want to mention if you are new to the stream, hi there. Yeah, I read books here on YouTube 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we read for about 2 hours. So we're just about done now, just about. Got one more short story to go. On this coming Monday, we'll be continuing with The House of the Seven Gables. We're about to start chapter 10, I think. Yeah, so on Monday, we'll start working again through that. But if you are enjoying this whole just live stream of cold reading short stories, and if you're new to the channel, please, I'd be so grateful if you would throw down a follow here on the old YouTubes. That would be great. My overly ambitious goal is to get 1,000 followers on the YouTube by the end of November, and that's in about 6 weeks. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if it happens. But in the meantime, thank you in advance. What the Moon Brings. I hate the moon. I am afraid of it. For when it shines on certain scenes familiar and loved, it sometimes makes them unfamiliar and hideous. It was in the spectral summer, when the moon shone down on the old garden where I wandered. The spectral summer of narcotic flowers and humid seas of foliage that bring wild and many-colored dreams. And as I walked by the shallow crystal stream, I saw unwanted ripples tipped with yellow light, as if those placid waters were drawn on in resistless currents to strange oceans that are not in the world. Silent and sparkling, bright and baleful, those moon-cursed waters hurried I knew not whither, whilst from the embowered banks white lotus blossoms fluttered one by one in the opiate night wind, and dropped despairingly into the stream, swirling away horribly under the arched carven bridge, and staring back with the sinister resignation of calm, dead faces. And as I ran along the shore, crushing sleeping flowers with heedless feet, and maddened ever by the fear of unknown things and the lure of the dead faces, I saw that the garden had no end under that moon. For where by day the walls were, there stretched now only new vistas of trees and paths, flowers and shrubs, stone idols and pagodas, and bendings of the yellow-litten stream, past grassy banks, and under grotesque bridges of marble. And the lips of the dead lotus faces whispered sadly, and bade me follow. Nor did I cease my steps till the stream became a river, and joined amidst marshes of swaying reeds and beaches of gleaming sand the shore of a vast and nameless sea. Upon that sea the hateful moon shone, and over its unvocal waves weird perfumes brooded. And as I saw therein the lotus faces vanish, I longed for nets that I might capture them, and learn from them the secrets which the moon had brought upon the night. But when the moon went over to the west, and the still tide ebbed from the sullen shore, I saw in that light old spires that the waves almost uncovered, and white columns gay with festoons of green seaweed. And knowing that to this sunken place all the dead had come, I trembled, and did not wish again to speak with the lotus faces. Yet when I saw afar out in the sea a black condor descend from the sky to seek rest on a vast reef, I would fain have questioned him, and asked him of those whom I had known when they were alive. This I would have asked him, had he not been so far away. But he was very far, and could not be seen at all when he drew nigh that gigantic reef. So I watched the tide go out under that sinking moon, and saw gleaming the spires, the towers, and the roofs of that dead, dripping city. And as I watched, my nostrils tried to close against the perfume-conquering stench of the world's dead. For truly, In this unplaced and forgotten spot had all the flesh of the churchyards gathered, for puffy sea worms to gnaw and glut upon. Over those horrors the evil moon now hung very low. But the puffy worms of the sea need no moon to feed by. And as I watched the ripples that told of the writhing of worms beneath, I felt a new chill from afar out, whither the condor had flown, as if my flesh had caught a horror before my eyes had seen it. Nor had my flesh trembled without cause, for when I raised my eyes, I saw that the waters had ebbed very low, showing much of the vast reef whose rim I had seen before. And when I saw that this reef was but the black basaled crown of a shocking icon, whose monstrous forehead now shone in the dim moonlight, and whose vile hooves must pour the hellish ooze miles below, I shrieked and shrieked, lest the hidden face rise above the waters, and lest the hidden eyes look at me, after the slinking away of that leering and treacherous yellow moon. And to escape this relentless thing, I plunged gladly and unhesitatingly into the stinking shallows, where amidst weedy walls and sunken streets, fat sea worms feast upon the world's dead. And that is the end of our stream. Yeah. All right. Not too bad, not too bad. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for tuning in. That was a little bit of a grim way to end the day. Man. Okay, but we'll be back on Monday here on YouTube. Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll be continuing with the House of the Seven Gables. But yeah, and like I said, we'll be on Twitch on Sunday for Short Story Sunday. You can find a link down below if you need to follow us there. Anyway, thank you for the new subscribers here on YouTube. Thank you for that. Yeah, little by little, we're gonna get there. We are gonna get there. Rose says, "Thank you for a great week, Mr. C and the book clubbers." We got the big moon cycle going on there. Yeah. Think now maybe Rose too might be a little leery of the moon. Have an awesome weekend there, BW. Anya as well. You guys have a great weekend. The Shadow fam, Mr. and Mrs. Shadow there. I'm not sure if they're still here. We Scorpion's Night. Yeah, let's get together sometime and get one of these Minecraft tours there. See what you've been building new. Is Gianna still with us? Not sure. Might be. Anyway, I need to say good night. Well, good afternoon to you all. I'm going to end the stream here. I'm going to get on with some work. Going to we're streaming gaming tonight, back on Twitch. I don't know what, but probably finishing off Carrion maybe before heading into a little Phantasy Star. But yeah, if you want to pop by for a little bit of gaming action, that's going to be over on Twitch, starting about 6 p.m. Pacific. 6 p.m. Pacific. Yeah.